Welcome, the Dweller of the Dark. We are a channel honoring the yellowed and blackened bones of many prominent authors. We will be digging up several obscure, strange, and forgotten authors who influenced many of the great horror, science fiction, and fantasy writers today. More tales of the horrifying, obscure, strange, and forgotten are climbing out of the tombs. Check out our links below for more information. Subscribe, comment, like, donate, or I'll send the devil of Black Bayou to rip your head off, as we did the like button. Send us ghoulish delights for the Skull and Bones collection. Your pound of writer's flesh will feed our ghouls for now. Children of horror, legion of ghouls. Tonight, we present our first in a series of witches' tales. A night of witches. We hope these dark tales cast their deadly spell and bewitch you as they have us. Enjoy. The Witch by Mary Elizabeth Coleridge. Written in 1892 for the rare Fancies Followings by Vespertilio. I have walked a great while over the snow, and I am not tall nor strong. My clothes are wet, and my teeth are set, and the way was hard and long. I have wandered over the fruitful earth, but I never came here before. Oh, lift me over the threshold and let me in at the door. The cutting wind is a cruel foe. I dare not stand in the blast. My hands are stone, and my voice a groan, and the worst of death is past. I am but a little maiden still. My little white feet are sore. Oh, lift me over the threshold and let me in at the door. Her voice was the voice that women have who plead for their heart's desire. She came, and the quivering flame sunk and died in the fire. It never was lit again on my hearth since I hurried across the floor to lift her over the threshold and let her in at the door. Mother of Toads by Clarkashtonsmith. Weird and powerful was the effect on the young apprentice of the potion given him by Mère Antoinette, known by the villagers as the Mother of Toads.
Why must you always hurry away, my little one?
The voice of Mère Antoinette, the witch, was an amorous croaking. She ogled Pierre, the apothecary's young apprentice, with eyes full-orbed and unblinking as those of a toad. The folds beneath her chin swelled like the throat of some great patrician. Her short, flat fingers outspread on her soiled apron revealed an appearance as of narrow webs between their first flanges. Pierre Baudin, as usual, gave no answer, but turned his eyes from Mère Antoinette with an air of impatience. Her voice, raucously coaxing, persisted. "Stay a while tonight, my pretty orphan. No one will miss you
in the village, and your master will not mind.
Pierre tossed his head with the disdain of a young Adonis. The witch was more than twice his age, and her charms were too uncouth and unsavory to tempt him for an instant. She was repellently fat and lumpish, and her skin possessed an unwholesome pallor. Also, her repute was such as to have nullified the attractions of a younger and fairer sorceress. Her witchcraft had made her feared among the peasantry of that remote province, where belief in spells and philters was still common. The people of Avron called her La Mère des Crapauds, Mother of Toads, a name given for more than one reason. Toads swarmed innumerably about her hut. They were said to be her familiars, and dark tales were told concerning their relationship to the sorceress and the duties they performed at her bidding. Such tales were all the more readily believed because of those patrician features that had always been remarked in her aspect. The youth disliked her, even as he disliked the sluggish, abnormally large toads on which he had sometimes trodden in the dusk upon the path between her hut and the village of Les Hiboux. He could hear some of these creatures croaking now, and it seemed, weirdly, that they uttered half-articulate echoes of the witch's words. It would be dark soon, he reflected. The path along the marshes was not pleasant by night, and he felt doubly anxious to depart. Still, without replying to Mère Antoinette's invitation, he reached for the black triangular vial she had set before him on her greasy table. The vial contained a philter of curious potency, which his master, Alain Le Dedon, had sent him to procure. Le Dedon, the village apothecary, was wont to deal surreptitiously in certain dubious medicaments supplied by the witch, and Pierre had often gone on such errands to her osé hidden hut. The old apothecary, whose humor was rough and ribald, had sometimes rallied Pierre concerning Mère Antoinette's preference for him. Remembering certain admonitory jibes, more witty than decent, the boy flushed angrily as he turned to go. "Stay," insisted Mère Antoinette.
The fog is cold on the marshes, and it thickens apace. I knew that you were coming, and I have mulled for you a goodly measure of the red wine of Zymes.
She removed the lid from an earthen pitcher and poured its steaming contents into a large cup. The purplish red wine creamed delectably, and an odor of hot, delicious spices filled the hut, overpowering the less agreeable odors from the simmering cauldron, the half-dried newts, vipers, bat wings, and evil, nauseous herbs hanging on the walls, and the reek of the black candles of pitch and corpse tallow that burned always by noon or night in that murky interior. "I'll drink it," said Pierre, a little grudgingly. "That is, if it contains nothing of your own concoction.
'Tis naught but sound wine, 4 seasons old, with spices of Arabia,
the sorceress croaked ingratiatingly.
'Twill warm your stomach.
And she added something inaudible as Pierre accepted the cup. Before drinking, he inhaled the fumes of the beverage with some caution, but was reassured by its pleasant smell. Surely it was innocent of any drug, any filter brewed by the witch, for, to his knowledge, her preparations were all evil-smelling. Still, as if warned by some premonition, he hesitated. Then he remembered that the sunset air was indeed chill, that mist had gathered furtively behind him as he came to Mère Antoinette's dwelling. The wine would fortify him for the dismal return walk to Les Hiboux. He quaffed it quickly and set down the cup. Truly, it is good wine, he declared. But I must go now.
Even as he spoke, he felt in his stomach and veins the spreading warmth of the alcohol, of the spices, of something more ardent than these. It seemed that his voice was unreal and strange, falling as if from a height above him. The warmth grew, mounting within him like a golden flame fed by magic oils. His blood, a seething torrent, poured tumultuously and more tumultuously through his members. There was a deep, soft thundering in his ears, a rosy dazzlement in his eyes. Somehow, the hut appeared to expand, to change luminously about him. He hardly recognized its squalid furnishings, its litter of baleful oddments, on which a torrid splendor was shed by the black candles, tipped with ruddy fire, that towered and swelled gigantically into the soft gloom. His blood burned as with the throbbing flame of the candles. It came to him for an instant that all this was a questionable enchantment, a glamour wrought by the witch's wine. Fear was upon him, and he wished to flee. Then, close beside him, he saw Mère Antoinette. Briefly, he wondered why he had thought her old and gross and repulsive, for it seemed that he looked upon Lilith, the first witch. The lumpish limbs and body had grown voluptuous. The pale, thick-lipped mouth enticed him with a promise of ampler kisses than other mouths could yield. He knew why the magic warmth mounted ever higher and hotter within him. "Do you like me now, my little one?" she questioned. Pierre awoke in the ashy dawn, when the tall black tapers had dwindled down and had melted limply in their sockets. Sick and confused, he sought vainly to remember where he was or what he had done. Then, turning a little, he saw beside him on the couch a thing that was like some impossible monster of ill dreams, a toad-like form large as a fat woman. Its limbs were somehow like a woman's arms and legs. Its pale, warty body pressed and bulged against him, and he felt the rounded softness of something that resembled a breast. Nausea rose within him as memory of that delirious night returned. Most foully, he had been beguiled by the witch and had succumbed to her evil enchantments. It seemed that an incubus smothered him, weighing upon all his limbs and body. He shut his eyes that he might no longer behold the loathsome thing that was Mère Antoinette in her true semblance. Slowly, with prodigious effort, he drew himself away from the crushing nightmare shape. It did not stir or appear to waken, and he slid quickly from the couch. Again, compelled by a noisome fascination, he peered at the thing on the couch and saw only the gross form of Mère Antoinette. Perhaps his impression of a great toad beside him had been but an illusion, a half-dream that lingered after slumber. He lost something of his nightmarish horror, but his gorge still rose in a sick disgust, remembering the lewdness to which he had yielded. Fearing that the witch might awaken at any moment and seek to detain him, he stole noiselessly from the hut. It was broad daylight, but a cold, hueless mist lay everywhere, shrouding the reedy marshes and hanging like a ghostly curtain on the path he must follow to Les Hiboux. Moving and seething always, the mist seemed to reach toward him with intercepting fingers as he started homeward. He shivered at its touch. He bowed his head and drew his cloak closer around him. Thicker and thicker, the mist swirled, coiling, writhing endlessly, as if to bar Pierre's progress. He could discern the twisting, narrow path for only a few paces in advance. It was hard to find the familiar landmarks, hard to recognize the osiers and willows that loomed suddenly before him like gray phantoms and faded again into the white nothingness as he went onward. Never had he seen such fog. It was like the blinding, stifling fumes of 1,000 witch-stirred cauldrons. Though he was not altogether sure of his surroundings, Pierre thought that he had covered half the distance to the village. Then, all at once, he began to meet the toads. They were hidden by the mist till he came close upon them, misshapen, unnaturally big, and bloated. They squatted in his way on the little footpath or hopped sluggishly before him from the pallid gloom on either hand. Several struck against his feet with a horrible and heavy flopping. He stepped unaware upon one of them and slipped in the squashy noisomeness it had made, barely saving himself from a headlong fall on the bog's rim. Black
Miry water gloomed close beside him as he staggered there. Turning to regain his path, he crushed others of the toads to an abhorrent pulp under his feet. The marshy soil was alive with them. They flopped against him from the mist, striking his legs, his bosom, his very face with their clammy bodies. They rose up by scores like a devil-driven legion. It seemed that there was a malignance and evil purpose in their movements, in the buffeting of their violent impact. He could make no progress on the swarming path, but lurched to and fro, slipping blindly and shielding his face with lifted hands. He felt an eerie consternation and eldritch horror. It was as if the nightmare of his awakening in the witch's hut had somehow returned upon him. The toads came always from the direction of Les Hiboux, as if to drive him back toward Mère Antoinette's dwelling. They bounded against him like a monstrous hail, like missiles flung by unseen demons. The ground was covered by them. The air was filled with their hurtling bodies. Once, he nearly went down beneath them. Their number seemed to increase. They pelted him in a noxious storm. He gave way before them. His courage broke, and he started to run at random, without knowing that he had left the safe path, losing all thought of direction in his frantic desire to escape from those impossible myriads. He plunged on amid the dim reeds and sedges, over ground that quivered gelatinously beneath him. Always at his heels, he heard the soft, heavy flopping of the toads, and sometimes they rose up like a sudden wall to bar his way and turn him aside. More than once, they drove him back from the verge of hidden quagmires into which he would otherwise have fallen. It was as if they were herding him deliberately and concertedly to a destined goal. Now, like the lifting of a dense curtain, the mist rolled away, and Pierre saw before him, in a golden dazzle of morning sunshine, the green, thick-growing osiers that surrounded Mère Antoinette's hut. The toads had all disappeared, though he could have sworn that hundreds of them were hopping close about him an instant previously, with a feeling of helpless fright and panic. He knew that he was still within the witch's toils, that the toads were indeed her familiars, as so many people believed them to be. They had prevented his escape and had brought him back to the foul creature, whether woman, patrician, or both, who was known as the mother of toads. Pierre's sensations were those of one who sinks momently deeper into some black and bottomless quicksand. He saw the witch emerge from the hut and come toward him. Her thick fingers with pale folds of skin between them, like the beginnings of a web, were stretched and flattened on the steaming cup that she carried. a sudden gust of wind arose, as if from nowhere, and bore to Pierre's nostrils the hot, familiar spices of the drugged wine.
Why did you leave so hastily, my little one?
There was an amorous wheedling in the very tone of the witch's question.
I should not have let you go without another cup of the good red wine, mulled and spiced for the warming of your stomach. See, I have prepared it for you, knowing that you would return.
She came very close to him as she spoke, leering and sidling, and held the cup toward his lips. Pierre grew dizzy with the strange fumes and turned his head away. It seemed that a paralyzing spell had seized his muscles, for the simple movement required an immense effort. His mind, however, was still clear, and the sick revulsion of that nightmare dawn returned upon him. He saw again the great toad that had lain at his side when he awakened.
I will not drink your wine, he said firmly. You are a foul witch, and I loathe you. Let me go. Why do you loathe me?
Croaked Mère Antoinette.
I can give you all that other women give, and more. You are not a woman, said Pierre. You are a big toad. I saw you in your true shape this morning. I'd rather drown in the marsh waters than stay with you again.
An indescribable change came upon the sorceress before Pierre had finished speaking. The leer slid from her thick and pallid features, leaving them blankly inhuman for an instant. Then her eyes bulged and goggled horribly, and her whole body appeared to swell as if inflated with venom.
Go then, she spat with a guttural virulence, but you will soon wish that you had stayed.
The queer paralysis had lifted from Pierre's muscles. It was as if the injunction of the angry witch had served to revoke an insidious, half-woven spell. With no parting glance or word, Pierre turned from her and fled with long, hasty steps, almost running on the path to Les Hiboux. He had gone little more than 100 paces when the fog began to return. It coiled shoreward in vast volumes from the marshes. It poured like smoke from the very ground at his feet. Almost instantly, the sun dimmed to a wan silver disk and disappeared. The blue heavens were lost in the pale and seething voidness overhead. The path before Pierre was blotted out till he seemed to walk on the sheer rim of a white abyss that moved with him as he went, like the clammy arms of specters with death-chilled fingers that clutched and caressed. The weird mist drew closer still about Pierre. They thickened in his nostrils and throat. They dripped in a heavy dew from his garments. They choked him with the fetor of rank waters and putrescent ooze.
and a stench as of liquefying corpses that had risen somewhere to the surface amid the fen. Then, from the blank whiteness, the toads assailed Pierre in a surging, solid wave that towered above his head and swept him from the dim path with the force of falling seas as it descended. He went down, splashing and floundering into water that swarmed with the numberless batracians. Foul slime was in his mouth and nose as he struggled to regain his footing. The water, however, was only knee-deep, and the bottom, though slippery and oozy, supported him with little yielding when he stood erect. He discerned indistinctly through the mist the nearby margin from which he had fallen, but his steps were weirdly and horribly hampered by the toad's seething waters when he strove to reach it, inch by inch. With a hopeless panic deepening upon him, he fought toward the solid shore. The toads leaped and tumbled about him with a dizzying eddy-like motion. They swirled like a viscid undertow around his feet and shins. They swept and swirled in great loathsome undulations against his retarded knees. However, he made slow and painful progress till his outstretched fingers could almost grasp the wiry sedges that trailed from the low bank. Then, from that mist-bound shore, there fell and broke upon him a second deluge of these demoniac toads, and Pierre was borne helplessly backward into the filthy waters, held down by the piling and crawling masses, and drowning in nauseous darkness at the thick oozed bottom. He clawed feebly at his assailants for a moment ere oblivion came. His fingers found among them the outlines of a monstrous form that was somehow toad-like, but large and heavy as a fat woman. Catnip by Robert Bloch. First published in March 1948. 1. Ronnie Shires stood before the mirror and slicked back his curly hair. He straightened his new sweater and stuck out his chest. Not bad. Had to watch the way he looked, with graduation only 2 weeks away and that election for class president coming up. If he could get to be class president, then next year in high school he'd swing a little weight, maybe. Go out for second team or something. But he had to look sharp.
Ronnie, better hurry or you'll be late.
Ma came out of the kitchen carrying his lunch. Ronnie wiped the smile off his face. She walked up behind him and put her arms around his waist.
Darling, I only wish your father were here to see you.
Ronnie wriggled free. Yeah, sure. Say, Ma.
Yes?
How's about letting me have another buck, huh? I got to get some things today.
Well, I suppose. But try to make it last, son. This graduation cost a lot of money. seems to me. I'll make it up to you someday, Ma. He watched her as she fumbled in her apron pocket and produced a wadded dollar bill. Thanks, be seeing you. He picked up his lunch and ran outside. He walked along, smiling and whistling, knowing Ma was watching him from the window. Then he turned the corner, halted under a tree and fished out a cigarette. He lit it and sauntered slowly across the street, puffing deeply. Out of the corner of his eye, he watched the Ogden house just ahead. Sure enough, the front screen door banged and Marvin Ogden came down the steps. Marvin was 15, 1 year older than Ronnie, but smaller and skinnier. He wore glasses and stuttered when he got excited, but he was valedictorian of the graduating class. Ronnie came up behind him, walking fast. "Hello, snot-face." Marvin wheeled. He avoided Ronnie's glare, but smiled weakly at the pavement. "I said, hello, snot-face. What's the matter? Don't you know your own name, jerk?" "Hello, Ronnie." "How's old snot-face today?" "Oh, gee, Ronnie, why do you have to talk like that? I never did anything to you, did I?" Ronnie spit in the direction of Marvin's shoes. "I'd like to see you just try doing something to me, you four-eyed little." Marvin began to walk away, but Ronnie kept pace. "Slow down, Jag. I want to talk to you." What is it, Ronnie?" "I don't want to be late." "Shut your yap." "But..." "Listen, you. What was the big idea in history exam yesterday when you pulled your paper away?" "You know, Ronnie, you aren't supposed to copy somebody else's answers." "You trying to tell me what to do, you sucker?" No. I mean, I only want to keep you out of trouble. What if Miss Sanders found out and you want to be elected class president? Why, if anybody knew..." Ronnie put his hand on Marvin's shoulder. He smiled. "You wouldn't ever tell her about it, would you, snot-face?" he murmured. "Of course not. Cross my heart." Ronnie continued to smile. He dug his fingers into Marvin's shoulder. With his other hand, he swept Marvin's books to the ground. As Marvin bent forward to pick them up, he kicked Marvin as hard as he could, bringing his knee up fast. Marvin sprawled on the sidewalk. He began to cry. Ronnie watched him as he attempted to rise. "This is just a sample of what you got coming if you squeal," he said. He stepped on the fingers of Marvin's left hand. "Sucker!" Marvin's sniffling faded from his ears as he turned the corner at the end of the block. Mary June was waiting for him under the trees. He came up behind her and slapped her hard. "Hello, you," he said. Mary June jumped about a foot, her curls bouncing on her shoulders. Then she turned and saw who it was.
"Oh, Ronnie, you oughtn't to."
"Shut up. I'm in a hurry. Can't be late the day before election. You lining up the girls?" "Sure, Ronnie. You know I promised. I had Ellen and Vicky over at the house last night, and they said they'd vote for you for sure. All the girls are gonna vote for you." "Well, they better." Ronnie threw his cigarette butt against a rose bush in the Elsner's yard.
Ronnie, you be careful. Want to start a fire?
Quit bossing me, he scowled.
I'm not trying to boss you, Ronnie. Only...
Oh, you make me sick. He quickened his pace, and the girl bit her lip as she endeavored to keep step with him.
Ronnie, wait for me. Wait for me,
he mocked her. What's the matter? You afraid you'll get lost or something?
No. No. I don't like to pass that old Mrs. Mingle's place. She always stares at me and makes faces.
She's nuts.
I'm scared of her, Ronnie. Aren't you?
Me scared of that old bat? She can go take a flying leap.
Don't talk so loud. She'll hear you.
Who cares? Ronnie marched boldly past the tree-shadowed cottage, behind the rusted iron fence. He stared insolently at the girl who made herself small against his shoulder, eyes averted from the ramshackle edifice. He deliberately slackened his pace as they passed the cottage, with its boarded-up windows, screened-in porch, and general air of withdrawal from the world. Mrs. Mingle herself was not in evidence today. Usually, she could be seen in the weed-infested garden at the side of the cottage, a tiny, dried-up old woman bending over her vines and plants, mumbling incessantly to herself or to the rattled black tomcat, which served as her constant companion. Old Pruneface ain't around, Ronnie observed loudly. Must be off someplace on her broomstick.
Ronnie, please.
Who cares? Ronnie pulled Mary June's curls. You dames are scared of everything, ain't you?
Aren't, Ronnie.
Don't tell me how to talk. Ronnie's gaze shifted again to the silent house, huddled in the shadows. A segment of shadow at the side of the cottage seemed to be moving. A black blur detached itself from the end of the porch. Ronnie recognized Mrs. Mingle's cat. It minced down the path towards the gate. Quickly, Ronnie stooped and found a rock. He grasped it, rose, aimed, and hurled the missile in one continuous movement. The cat hissed, then squalled in pain as the rock grazed its ribs.
Oh, Ronnie!
Come on, let's run before she sees us. They flew down the street. The school bell drowned out the cat yowl. Here we go, said Ronnie. You do my homework for me. Good? Give it here once. He snatched the papers from Mary June's hand and sprinted ahead. The girl stood watching him, smiling her admiration. From behind the fence, the cat watched too and licked its jaws. 2. It happened that afternoon, after school. Ronnie and Joe Gardan and Seymour Higgins were futzing around with a baseball, and he was talking about the outfit Ma promised to buy him this summer if the dressmaking business picked up. Only he made it sound like he was getting the outfit for sure, and that they could all use the mask and mitt It didn't hurt to build it up a little. With election tomorrow, he had to stand in good with the whole gang. He knew if he hung around the schoolyard much longer, Mary June would come out and want him to walk her home. He was sick of her. Oh, she was all right for homework and such stuff, but these guys would just laugh at him if he went off with a dame. So he said, how about going down the street to in front of the pool hall and maybe hang around to see if somebody would shoot a game? He'd pay. Besides, they could smoke. Ronnie knew that these guys didn't smoke, but it sounded big shot, and that's what he wanted. They all followed him down the street, pounding their cleats on the sidewalk. It made a lot of noise because everything was so quiet. All Ronnie could hear was the cat. They were passing Mrs. Mingle's, and there was this cat rolling around in the garden on its back and on its stomach, playing with some kind of ball. It purred and meowed and whined. "Look!" yelled Joe Garden. "Is the cat's having a fit or something, huh?" "Lice," said Ronnie. "Damned, mangy old things full of lice and fleas and stuff. I socked it a good one this morning." "You did?" "Sure, with a rock. This big, too." He made a watermelon with his hands. "Aren't you afraid of old Lady Mangle?" "Afraid? Why, that dried up old—" "Catnip," said Seymour Higgins. "That's what she's got. Ball of catnip. Old Mingle buys it for her. My old man says she buys everything for that cat. Special food and sardines. Treats it like a baby. Ever see them walk down the street together?" "Catnip, huh?" Joe peered through the fence. "Wonder why they like it so much. Gets 'em wild, doesn't it? Cats'll do anything for catnip." The cat squealed, sniffing and clawing at the ball. Ronnie scowled at it. "I hate cats. Somebody oughta drowned that damn thing." "Better not let Mrs. Mingle hear you talk like that," Seymour cautioned. "She'll put the evil eye on you." "Bull." "Well, she grows them herbs and stuff, and my old lady says—" "Bull." "All right, but I wouldn't go monkeying around her or her old cat either. I'll show you." Before he knew it, Ronnie was opening the gate. He advanced toward the black tomcat as the boys gaped. The cat crouched over the catnip, eyes flattened against a velveteen skull. Ronnie hesitated a moment, gauging the glitter of claws, the glare of agate eyes. But the gang was watching. "Scat!" he shouted. He advanced, waving his arms. The cat sidled backwards. Ronnie feinted with his hand and scooped up the catnip ball. "See? I got it, you guys. I got it."
Put that down!
He didn't see the door open. He didn't see her walk down the steps. But suddenly, she was there, leaning on her cane, wearing a black dress that fitted tightly over her tiny frame. She seemed hardly any bigger than the cat which crouched at her side. Her hair was gray and wrinkled and dead. Her face was gray and wrinkled and dead. But her eyes, they were agate eyes,
like the cat's. They glowed, and when she talked, she spit the way the cat did.
Put that down, young man.
Ronnie began to shake. It was only a chill. Everybody gets chills now and then. And could he help it if he shook so hard the catnip just fell out of his hand? He wasn't scared. He had to show the gang he wasn't scared of this skinny, little dried up old woman. It was hard to breathe. He was shaking so, but he managed. He filled his lungs and opened his mouth. You old witch, he yelled. The agate eyes widened. They were bigger than she was. All he could see were the eyes. Witch eyes. Now that he had said it, he knew it was true. Witch. She was a witch.
You insolent puppy. I've a good mind to cut out your lying tongue.
Jeez, she wasn't kidding. Now she was coming closer, and the cat was inching up on him. And then she raised the cane in the air. She was going to hit him. The witch was after him. Oh, Ma, no, don't. Oh, Ronnie ran. 3. Could he help it? Jeez, the guys ran too. They'd run before he did, even. He had to run. The old bat was crazy. Anybody could see that. Besides, if he'd stayed, she'd have tried to hit him, and maybe he'd let her have it. He was only trying to keep out of trouble. That was all. Ronnie told it to himself over and over at supper time, but that didn't do any good, telling it to himself. It was the guys he had to tell it to, and fast. He had to explain it before election tomorrow.
Ronnie, what's the matter? You sick?
No, Ma.
Then why don't you answer a person? I declare, you haven't said 10 words since you came in the house, and you aren't eating your supper.
Not hungry.
Something bothering you, son?
No, leave me alone.
It's that election tomorrow, isn't it?
Leave me alone. Ronnie rose. I'm going out.
Ronnie!
I gotta see Joe. Important.
Back by 9, remember?
Yeah, sure. He went outside. The night was cool, windy for this time of year. Ronnie shivered a little as he turned the corner. Maybe a cigarette. He lit a match, and a shower of sparks spiraled to the sky. Ronnie began to walk, puffing nervously. He had to see Joe and the others and explain. Yeah, right now, too, if they told anybody else. It was dark. The light on the corner was out, and Ogdens weren't home. That made it darker because Mrs. Mingle never showed a light in her cottage. Mrs. Mingle. Her cottage was up ahead. He'd better cross the street. What was the matter with him? Was he getting chicken guts? Afraid of that damned old woman? That old witch? He puffed, gulped, expanded his chest. Just let her try anything. Just let her be hiding under the trees, waiting to grab out at him with her big claws and hiss. What was he talking about anyway? That was the cat. Nuts to her cat, and her too. He'd show them. Ronnie walked past the dark shadow where Mrs. Mingle dwelt. He whistled defiance, and
emphasized it by shooting his cigarette butt across the fence. Sparks flew and were swallowed by the mouth of the night. Ronnie paused and peered over the fence. Everything was black and still. There was nothing to be afraid of. Everything was black. Everything except that flicker. It came from up the path under the porch. He could see the porch now because there was a light. Not a steady light, a wavering light, like a fire. A fire where his cigarette had landed. The cottage was beginning to burn. Ronnie gulped and clung to the fence. Yes, it was on fire, all right. Mrs. Mingle would come out and the firemen would come and they'd find the butt and see him, and then he fled down the street. The wind cat-howled behind him. The wind that fanned the flames that burned the cottage. Ma was in bed. He managed to slow down and walk softly as he slipped into the house, up the stairs. He undressed in the dark and sought sanctuary between the bed sheets. When he got the covers over his head, he had another chill. Lying there, trembling, not daring to look out of the window and see the glare from the other side of the block. Ronnie's teeth chattered. He knew he was going to pass out in a minute. Then he heard the screaming from far away. Fire engines. Somebody had called them. He needn't worry now. Why should the sound frighten him? It was only a siren. It wasn't Mrs. Mingle screaming. It couldn't be. She was all right. He was all right. Nobody knew. Ronnie fell asleep with the wind and the siren wailing in his ears. His slumber was deep, and only once was there an interruption. That was along towards morning when he thought he heard a noise at the window. It was a scraping sound. The wind, of course. And it must have been the wind, too, that sobbed and whined and whimpered beneath the windowsill at dawn. It was only Ronnie's imagination, Ronnie's conscience, that transformed the sound into the wailing of a cat. 4. Ronnie! It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a cat. Ma was calling him. Ronnie! Oh, Ronnie! He opened his eyes, shielding them from the sun shafts. I declare, you might answer a person. He heard her grumbling to herself downstairs. Then she called again. Ronnie! I'm coming, Ma. He got out of bed, went to the bathroom, and dressed. She was waiting for him in the kitchen. Land sakes! You sure slept sound last night. Didn't you hear the fire engines? Ronnie dropped a slice of toast. What engines? Ma's voice rose. Don't you know? Why, boy, it was just awful. Mrs. Mingle's cottage burned down. Yeah? He had trouble picking up the toast again. The poor old lady. Just think of it. Trapped in there. He had to shut her up. He couldn't stand what was coming next. But what could he say? How could he stop her? Burned alive. The whole place was on fire. When they got there, the Ogdens saw it
when they came home and Mr. Ogden called the firemen. But it was too late. When I think of that old lady, it just makes me...
Without a word, Ronnie rose from the table and left the room. He didn't wait for his lunch. He didn't bother to examine himself in the mirror. He went outside before he cried or screamed or hauled off and hit Ma in the puss. The puss, it was waiting for him on the front walk. The black bundle with the agate eyes. The cat, Mrs. Mingle's cat, waiting for him to come out. Ronnie took a deep breath before he opened the gate. The cat didn't make a sound, didn't stir. It just hunched up on the sidewalk and stared at him. He watched it for a moment, then cast about for a stick. There was a hunk of lath near the porch. He picked it up and swung it. Then he opened the gate. "Scat!" he said. The cat retreated. Ronnie walked away. The cat moved after him. Ronnie wheeled, brandishing the stick. "Scram before I let you have it!" The cat stood still. Ronnie stared at it. Why hadn't the damn thing burned up in the fire? And what was it doing here? He gripped the lathe. It felt good between his fingers, splinters and all. Just let that mangy Tom start anything. He walked along, not looking back. What was the matter with him? Suppose the cat did follow him. It couldn't hurt him any. Neither could old Mingle. She was dead. The dirty witch. Talking about cutting his tongue out. Well, she got what was coming to her, all right. Too bad her scroungy cat was still around. If it didn't watch out, he'd fix it too. He should worry now. Nobody was going to find out about that cigarette. Mrs. Mingle was dead. He ought to be glad everything was all right. Sure, he felt great. The shadow followed him down the street. "Get out of here!" Ronnie turned and heaved the lathe at the cat. It hissed. Ronnie heard the wind hiss. Heard his cigarette butt hiss. Heard Mrs. Mingle hiss. He began to run. The cat ran after him. "Hey, Ronnie!" Marvin Ogden was calling him. He couldn't stop now, not even to hit the punk. He ran on. The cat kept pace. Then he was winded, and he slowed down. It was just in time, too. Up ahead was a crowd of kids standing on the sidewalk in front of a heap of charred, smoking boards. They were looking at Mingle's cottage. Ronnie closed his eyes and darted back up the street. The cat followed. He had to get rid of it before he went to school. What if people saw him with her cat? Maybe they'd start to talk. He had to get rid of it. Ronnie ran clear down to Sinclair Street. The cat was right behind him. On the corner, he picked up a stone and let fly. The cat dodged. Then it sat down on the sidewalk and looked at him. Just looked. Ronnie couldn't take his eyes off the cat. It stared so. Mrs. Mingle had stared too. But she was dead. And this was only a cat. A cat he had to get away from fast. The streetcar came down Sinclair Street. Ronnie found a dime in his pocket and boarded the car. The cat didn't move. He stood on the platform as the car pulled away and looked back at the cat. It just sat there. Ronnie rode around the loop, then transferred to the Hollis Avenue car. It brought him over to the school, 10 minutes late. He got off and started to hurry across the street. A shadow crossed the entrance to the building. Ronnie saw the cat. It squatted there, waiting. He ran. That's all Ronnie remembered of the rest of the morning. He ran, and the cat followed. He couldn't go to school. He couldn't be there for the election. He couldn't get rid of the cat. He ran up and down the streets, back and forth, all over the whole neighborhood, stopping and dodging and throwing stones and swearing and panting and sweating. But always the running and always the cat right behind him. Once it started to chase him, and before he knew it, he was heading straight for the place where the burned smell filled the air, straight for the ruins of Mrs. Mingle's cottage. The cat wanted him to go there, wanted him to see. Ronnie began to cry. He sobbed and panted all the way home. The cat didn't make a sound. It followed him. All right, let it. He'd fix it. He'd tell Ma. Ma would get rid of it for him. Ma. Ma! He yelled as he ran up the steps. No answer. She was out, marketing, and the cat crept up the steps behind him. Ronnie slammed the door, locked it. Ma had her key. He was safe now. Safe at home. Safe in bed. He wanted to go to bed and pull the covers over his head. Wait for Ma to come and make everything all right. There was a scratching at the door. Ma! His scream echoed through the empty house. He ran upstairs. The scratching died away, and then he heard the footsteps on the porch. The slow footsteps. He heard the rattling and turning of the doorknob. It was Old Lady Mingle coming from the grave. It was the witch coming to get him. It was... Ma!
Ronnie, what's the matter? What you doing home from school?
He heard her. It was all right. Just in time, Ronnie closed his mouth. He couldn't tell her about the cat. He mustn't ever tell her. Then everything would come out. He had to be careful what he said. I got sick to my stomach, he said. Miss Sanders said I should come home and lay down. Ronnie lay in bed and dozed as the afternoon shadows ran in long black ribbons across the bedroom floor. He smiled to himself. What a sucker he was! Afraid of a cat. Maybe there wasn't even a cat. All in his mind. Dope!
Ronnie, you all right?
Ma called up from the foot of the stairs. Yes, Ma. I feel lots better. Sure, he felt better. He could get up now and eat supper if he wanted. In just a minute, he'd put his clothes on and go downstairs. He started to push the sheets off. It was dark in the room now, just about supper time. Then Ronnie heard it. A scratching, a scurrying. From the hall? No, it couldn't be in the hall. Then where? The window, it was open, and the scratching came from the ledge outside. He had to close it fast. Ronnie jumped out of bed, barking his shin against the chair as he groped through the dusk. Then he was at the window, slamming it down tight. He heard the scratching, and it came from inside the room. Ronnie hurled himself upon the bed, clawing the covers up to his chin. His eyes bulged against the darkness. Where was it? He saw nothing but shadows. Which shadow moved? Where was it? Ronnie didn't know. All he knew was that he lay in bed, waiting, thinking of Mrs. Mingle and her cat, and how she was a witch and died because he'd killed her. Or had he killed her? He was all mixed up. He couldn't remember. He didn't know what was real and what wasn't real anymore. He couldn't tell which shadow would move next. And then he could. The round shadow was moving. The round black ball was inching across the floor from beneath the window. It was the cat, all right, because shadows don't have claws that scrape. Shadows don't leap through the air and perch on the bedpost, grinning at you with yellow eyes and yellow teeth. Grinning the way Mrs. Mingle grinned. The cat was big. Its eyes were big. Its teeth were big. It crouched there, hunching to spring. Ronnie opened his mouth to scream. Then the shadow was sailing through the air, coming at him, at his face, at his open mouth. The claws were fastened in his cheeks, forcing his jaws apart, and the head dipped. Far away, under the pane, somebody was calling, "Ronnie! Oh, Ronnie!" Everything was fire. Ronnie lashed out, and suddenly the shadow went away. "Ronnie, what's the matter with you?" He sat bolt upright in the bed. His mouth worked, and he opened it to scream, but no sound came out. Nothing came out except that gushing red wetness. "Ronnie, why don't you answer me?" A horrible, guttural sound came from deep within Ronnie's throat, but no words. There never would be any words. "Ronnie, what's the matter? Has the cat got your tongue?"
Curse of the Sea Witch by Jeffrey LeBlanc. First published in Kindle Vella, March 16th, 2022. Episode 1. The Murder. And some return by the failing light, and some in the waking dream, for she hears the heels of the dripping ghost that ride the rough roof beam. Kipling. These scoundrels were of the sea, rough men, some would say, vagabonds and criminals, others might profess. Brawlers and braggarts abounded on Grand Isle, crowing boasters and sailors who drank whiskey and rye, as they roared and reared from shore to shore of the seaside town where many a pirate or devil might dwell. Such were the evil likes of Hawkeye Santney and his crooked minion Blisters Petrie. How many times I had, as a sun-tanned, golden-haired teen, stolen to Cisco's Cajun Cantina door to listen to their foul curses. How my ears strained and I giggled with wicked merriment at their profane arguments. Oh, how my childhood friends and I mimicked and embellished their wild sea songs, totally fearful of them and in total jealous admiration of these sailors who had journeyed beyond the jetties and into ocean blue. Islanders of Grand Isle gazed on them with utter fear and admiration, for they were not like the rest of the Grand Isle men. They were not content to ply their trade in the bay or estuaries along the coast. They were not men who held to the jagged teeth of the shoals and the drumming of drifting dunes. No net shacks, no cast nets, and certainly no small bateau for them. Deep, heaving oceans were their calling. Seas of crystalline blue called these marauders. Farther and farther they delved the deeps. Greater their journeys than any other man in the town, for they shipped on the great trading and shrimping fleets that went out on the white tides to braid the restless emerald ocean and make ports on many an exotic island. Fast were the times I recall in the little seacoast town of Grand Isle when Hawkeye Santney came back to our port, sniveling Blisters Petrie at his hip, the pair swaggering down the gangway. Salty and thread-worn were their sea clothes, cracked and aged were their ocean boots and broad leather belts that held pistol and flapjack. Taunts and insults were in every condescending greeting to some favored acquaintance, an illicit grope or forced kiss to some woman that dared venture too near, then up asphalt or gravel road roaring some vulgar verse of the sea. Vulturous cringers, idiotic idlers, and the half-witted hangers-on would swarm about the two ocean desperadoes. Oh, how they encouraged, flattered, and smirked with these rogues. Maniacal was the laughter from the complicit with each nasty jest. For to the patrons of Cisco's Cajun Cantina, and to some of the weaker-minded of Grand Isle, Hawkeye and Blisters, with their roguish talk and devilish deeds, were of cavalier cloth. The tales brought by these men of the Caribbean, of Haiti, and of distant seas made them appear as valiant as knights of Arthurian legend, men of adventure, men of blood and brawn, and most certainly men of salt and sea. Fear was a square hammer they bludgeoned friend or foes with. Grand Isle lived in fear of Hawkeye and Blisters. Such was their reign that when a man was beaten or a woman insulted, the villagers cursed and muttered under breath and did nothing. Dark was the day when Matty Badeau's daughter was put to their boot. How horrid were their insults to Millie Badeau! How disgusting was the shame by Hawkeye Santney! No one of Grand Isle blood grew courage or dared even to put into words what all thought. Matty Badeau had never married, living alone with her precious child in a rundown camp close to Caminada Pass. So close did their modest home lay to the sea that in high tide the waves rolled gently to the ocean-worn door. Was Maddie Badeau a witch, as has been claimed? I do not know. The people of Grand Isle on chilled, firelit nights would say so. Maddie had proven herself of such preternatural discourse. As a Grand Isle witch proclaimed, she carried the darkness of an unnerving gaze. On her countenance were the grim, gangly, and gaunt traits of an ancient sorcerer who had little to say to anyone. They kept to themselves, minded their own matters, and labored meagerly, gathering oysters, crabs, and drying fish. Fools are fleeting. Fools are not long for a world filled with wolves. Such was the case of Millie Badeau. Foolish was this pretty child. Vain, naive, and idiotic was Millie to the point of absolute gullibility. Easily beguiled, she fell prey to the carnivorous compliments of Hawkeye Santony. Hazy and deathly gray was that cold November day when we found the girl. Knife sharp did the icy air bite our hands as we probed the surf. A churned sea chilled with the frigid breeze out of the north when old Maddie came into the town street sobbing that her precious Millie had vanished. We scattered and scoured the waves and dunes of the beach. Further, we trekked in our search among the scrub oaks and myrtles to find her. Curiously or not, Hawkeye Santony, Blisters Petrie, and their ilk did not join in. Within Cisco's, they played poker, rattled the bones, and drank the time away. Beyond the surf and salt marsh, as they frolicked in merriment, our search party heard the eternal ebb and flow of tide. We heard the heaving, restless Leviathan through the day and night as we searched for Maddie Badeau's beloved daughter. By the next morning, in the faint flickering of early light of the ghostly dawn, our search was at an end. The sea returned a lost child. The ghastly image drifted in on the surf. Maddie Badeau's precious child had come home. With a loving caress, the tides bore Millie Badeau gently across the alluvial sands and marsh grass. Great was the sea's grasp that it laid Maddie's girl almost at her own door. Satin white was the skin of Millie Badeau. Her arms were outstretched, reaching for comfort from the silvery sea. Ocean foam danced and cloaked her calm face, and the ashen tide sighed about her slender limbs. Maddie Badeau's eyes were cryptic stone, yet she stood above her dead Millie, silent as the grave. Maddie kept her vigil of silence until Hawkeye Santony and his desperados approached the scene. After their night of debauchery, swooning and swaying, they had reeled down from the cantina, glass mugs still in their hands. Drugged and drunk was Hawkeye, but the people made way to let him pass. All of the town suspicious, yet Not a one lifted a hand in vengeance. Murder may have been in their souls, but cowardice was in their hearts.
The fairest fade, and the fairest now rot.
Ha ha! Hawkeye laughed at Maddie Baddow as she held the body of her Millie. Episode 2. The Curse. The gray and emerald waves from the surf roared eternal into the beach as Hawkeye Santney continued mockingly to all present.
Dear Lord,
Swore Hawkeye.
the poor, innocent child has drowned herself. Blisters, such a poor waste of life.
The knuckle-dragging minion, Blisters Petrie, laughed as he was nudged in the ribs by Hawkeye. Then there was a twist of his oily, haggard mouth to stifle a giggle and a gasp. Blisters had loathed Maddie Baddow since the day she mocked him at the shrimp shack for the fool he was. The sea witch coined the named Blisters in front of the town after one of his misadventures with a tainted flower. Seagulls cried above the crowd that had encircled the mother with her dead child. Someone, Nate Thibodeau maybe, could have sworn it was a murder of crows. It seemed that all manner of winged creatures, vulture, bats, and swarms of locusts seemed to hover and swarm around the scene. For sure it was preternatural event for the murdered Millie Baddow. Ethelterio would swear later that the creatures seemed to be displaying condolences to Maddie Baddow for her loss. But all the sea witch could do was scream and cry in angst and sorrow. With a stolen glass mug swaying with whiskey, possibly Jack Daniels or Jim Beam, Hawkeye Santney lifted a feigned toast to the corpse swaying on his uncertain, rickety legs. He drunkenly bellowed while many turned away, aghast and in disgust.
May Millie Baddow's phantom eternally haunt these shores.
Lunatic eyes ablaze, furnace with the fires of hell itself, Maddie Baddow spoke. Her words were predatory and screeching as an owl's as they broke from Maddie in a scream. This ghastly scream sent an icy sea chill up and down the spines of the crowd.
I bring forth from the hollows of Asmodeus, from the winding labyrinth of Aziel, and from the blackened heart of my master, Lucifer the Lightbringer, a curse upon you and all your heirs, Rubier, Hawkeye, Santney,
She screamed.
our Lord above curses you as well. This curse will be with you to all eternity, long after your bones are dust. May your murderous eyes be beholden on sights of terror so profound that they char and scorch the soul of you. May you be granted no respite, no forgiveness, and die so gruesome a death that men will shudder hearing your name. And in the void, in the darkness, in the dismal shores of the lake of fire, may you, Hawkeye Santney, writhe in hell's flames infinitely. This curse I place on you sails with you by sea and walks with you by land. Hawkeye Santney, it lumbers always with you by cold earth and by frigid air. You shall be stalked by winged demons of the wilds, serpentine wraiths of the swamplands, fanged phantoms of the forest, and the ghouls and goblins of the mountains. And you.
Her skeletal fingers stabbed out as a scythe at Blister's Petrie. Her screeching accusation and her maniacal eyes caused Blisters to jump and stagger backwards, his face as white as a funeral pall covered in the shimmer of panicked sweat.
Your hands, Merlot, Blister's Petrie, shall be the death of Robert Hawkeye Sidney in this world and all other worlds unknown. And Hawkeye, in return, for eternity, shall always be the death of you. By murderous hands, Hawkeye Sidney will gladly go through the doors of hell, and Minion, your master, shall bring you to the gallows tree of a distant land. For the hideous deed done, I set the seal of death upon your brow, Robert Hawkeye Sidney. Know a life of true terror, waking every day, breathing every inspired breath, feeling every last beat of your black heart, that you will die in horror far out upon the bluest sea. But unlike the gentle tide that brought my Millie home, the same sea shall reject and toss you to the damned. Hawkeye, your vile carcass will be shunned to the sands, only to be gnawed and chewed by the vile creatures of those same black sands.
Lightning crashed in the distance from a sudden approaching storm. All there would swear the sea witch conjured it.
I, Robert Hawkeye Sidney.
She spoke again with a viper's venom and unearthly intensity to cause the drunken mockery on the man's face to change to that of swinish ignorance.
Do you hear how the sea roars for your corpse, Hawkeye? A corpse it will not keep. Frost and heavy snows will cover the marshes and fields. When the last frost lifts to fog from the marshes, Hawkeye Sidney, your bloated, rotted corpse will lie at my feet. And in my joy, I shall laugh as you did today. I will make mockery and merry of your demise, and surely I will spit upon your dead body and be content.
On her last words, flashes of lightning arced all around Hawkeye and Blisters. The two cursed men staggered away from Maddie and the townsfolk, walking off to their makeshift homes with the sun at zenith on the morn. Robert Hawkeye Sidney and Blister's Petrie both looked like two men headed to the gallows. The two drunkards, long shadows following behind as they maneuvered through the brown sands homeward. Ghostly shadows that followed like a sea curse. Gerard Bradbury, with two of his sons, gathered up the remains of Millie Badeau. His wife Lucille and Ethel Theriot assisted Maddie back into town, expecting Maddie to break down and scream and cry again. The sea witch did not. Reaching town by some time after 10 a.m. with Millie's body, the ice house was organized to house the dead. Being the small island had no morgue, it was the coldest place to keep her fresh. The champagnes of shrimp and bushels of crabs were moved to make place for Millie's body.
Once the area was vacated, Millie's corpse was packed in ice, and the men said a few prayers before covering her face in a tarp. With the body secure and a local deputy on watch to prevent any desecration, the town set to organizing the wake and funeral for the poor child. First priority was to give Maddie the best place to stay and best place to grieve alone. The destitute mother had no money, but was treated to the finest furnishings by the town. The best meals were arranged that Maddie Badeau could not eat. The best room on the island was allotted to her by the mayor, which she refused to stay. Forced by the Grand Isle community, she relented on the latter and was placed alone in the mayor's own house. It was the charitable thing to do, at least, since none had bothered to arrest the murderers. Besides, who could say with certainty that Hawkeye Santony and Blisters Petrie might not sober up and decide to kill Maddie too? The wake the next day was brief, but heartfelt. Maddie pushed back the locks of hair from the frozen Millie. Chilled in ice though, flies had swarmed around mother and daughter as she did this motherly gesture. Onlookers could swear that none of the flies, however, would land on the body. A casket of scrub oak from the island's many trees was cut and split to make a coffin. Workers spent the better part of the night carving and nailing it together. The name, Millie Badeau, was carved in the lid and on a piece of concrete recovered from a washed-away house from Apple Street. Men dug with purpose well into the morning to prepare the grave, a grave plot donated generously again by the mayor. This would be Millie Badeau's final place of rest. The funeral was a hastened affair. No one wanted any more of the Hawkeye and Blisters disruption. Quickly, they performed the rites and moved forward to conclusion. It was perplexing and hideous, the mayor and his ilk, with the hurried behavior toward the affair, as if the child had not existed. But their cowardice would have no other course of action. What would it accomplish to not speed up the funeral? What was the alternative, really? Face a prolonged ordeal and risk to rouse the wrath of two men quite capable of getting away with murder? As Alex Prosperi had said in a whispered meeting before the service,
"Let those two murderers sleep off their drunk while we hurry to honor our gentle daughter of the community."
A few brief words by Father Robert Hayes and a beautiful song of Ave Maria by Gladys Bradbury, the town's organist, brought everyone sobbing with tears. No memories by the grieving were allowed, and the mother could not present her fondest memories of her beloved daughter. No story shared, only in finality. Maddie was allowed a moment to say last words to Millie's body before the coffin was closed and lowered.
"Farewell, foolish flower, with a heart too good for this world. Millie, you grew lovely and you grew beautiful, only to be cut down as a ragged weed too soon. I was blessed to have you with me in this world, but alas, daughter, I warned you time immemorial that your kind heart was always going to be your folly and certain doom. How wrong I wish I had been, my stolen treasure.
And with those words, Maddie cried one last tear. Everyone watched as that same tear fell on the face of the iced corpse. Blood-red roses were dropped onto Millie Badeau's coffin as it was laid to final rest into the shifting sands of Grand Isle. Episode 3, on Strange Tides. Waking groggily from the previous day's misadventures on seas that many would swear had a strange ebb and flow, Hawkeye and his faithful minion sailed at dawn for a long voyage. Their final destination was to be the South Pacific Seas. Their voyage for spices and ore would bring them as far east as Timor-Leste, a sail that would no doubt have them passing treacherously a few miles from Komodo. On the voyage, they would stop briefly in Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, and Ambon for supplies and fuel. On that same fog-filled morning, when heaven itself seemed ready to cry tears of icy rain, Maddie Badeau went back to her cold hut to work. She'd continue to prepare and ply her wares for seafood and driftwood collecting. How, with Millie's cold body put to ground just 2 days before, had Maddie aged? She seemed lean and fragile. You could call it emaciation, but that wasn't quite accurate. Her appearance was more a picture of the ghastly reaper ready to bring home the dead. Yes, that description would be the correct one. With her warm shawl covering her head, a twisting, Sith-like knob of a walking stick, and Maddie's flapping black funeral attire, the image of death's harbinger was complete. On we watched the leaner and grimmer woman slowly hobble home, ever her gaze fixed in rage at the sea, ever her eyes sought with vengeance while watching Hawkeye and Blisters sail away, ever her eyes flamed red as smoldered coals with a light not of the sane. Days, weeks, and months glided by, and people whispered among themselves that Maddie's days were slowly numbered. Fading fast, the phantom of a once poor but prideful woman of the sea, refusing care, refusing conversation, refusing love and companionship, refusing charitable aid from any of us. Maddie Badeau cryptically hobbled along the winding beach trails in her secretive ways, did her task, and proceeded onward. We, however, continued on knowing her inevitable death was drawing near. The summer blazed brightly on the seascape, the fiery sky red every morn with ominous and, dare say, treacherous abode. Tourists came and tourists went. Sport and commercial fishermen lingered longer through the blaze and haze of Grand Isle's shortest summer. Cold winds, Arctic winds, began blasting in as early as mid-August. Then, by September, unusual ice storms pelted the beaches and assaulted the camps with unceasing fury. Forecasted weather reports posted down at Bon Voyage Marina even shockingly had Grand Isle receiving half a foot of snow within the next week. As I stated, it was a short summer, a summer that left all longing for better days. It was a violent summer, and it most assuredly foreshadowed a very brutal winter for the islanders. The snows arrived, again to everyone's surprise. The bleak expanse of barren marshlands frozen to depths never seen before. Boats were trapped in docks, unable to oyster, to fish, or to shrimp. Even during that winter's warmest day, the ice and frost never melted. An event very unusual, very unnatural, which caused much unease and much concern, and a deluge of comments among the townsfolk at civic meetings. Superstitions abounded, and talk of the sea witch's curse oozed up in many a whisper. But from early dawn to the onset of dusk, life for Maddie Batto remained unfazed. She would hobble and, dare I say, possibly hover up on the beach. Her eyes still smoldered with hate and vengeance, with a steel-cold stare on the farthest horizon of the sea. She'd turn her gaze briefly out at the frosted marshes and the drifts of snow which glittered on the beaches and estuaries. Then those furnace ice-blue eyes returned to the sea with the fiercest intensity in her gaze. The days during that time on Grand Isle grew frigid and chilled, while their duration of warming light grew ever shorter. Everyone on the island huddled everywhere, trying to find the best places to stay warm. Every drop in degree bringing more anxiety to all in Grand Isle. We had to find ways to beat the howling snow winds. Oh, those deathly, icy nights became quite perilous. Nights longer and nights evilly darker, and the cold gray tides came sweeping along the bleak, desolate strands, bearing the rain, the frosted mist, sleet, and killing snows of the sharp northern fronts.
The Shadow on the Stone by Thomas Hardy, published in 1917 for Moments of Vision. I went by the druid's stone that broods in the garden, white and lone, and I stopped and looked at the shifting shadows that at some moments fall thereon. From the tree hard by with a rhythmic swing, and they shaped in my imagining to the shade that a well-known head and shoulders threw there when she was gardening. I thought her behind my back, yea, her I long had learned to lack, and I said, I am sure you are standing behind me, though how do you get into this old track? And there was no sound but the fall of a leaf as a sad response. And to keep down grief
I would not turn my head to discover that there was nothing in my belief. Yet, I wanted to look and see that nobody stood at the back of me. But I thought once more, nay, I'll not unvision a shape which somehow there may be. So I went on softly from the glade and left her behind me, throwing her shade, as she were indeed an apparition, my head unturned, lest my dream should fade. Thank you for listening. Have a great night.